The air held the sharp bite of late autumn, a stark contrast to the dust that coated everything in Redemption Gulch. Eliza stepped down from the train onto the rough-hewn platform, her grip tightening on the worn valise. She smoothed the simple gray traveling dress, a garment chosen for practicality rather than hope. At 37, practicality was a familiar companion. She scanned the faces waiting, a knot forming in her stomach. There. The man's features matched the photograph, though the reality held a harder edge than the carefully posed image. He was younger than she had anticipated, perhaps 40. His eyes, when they found her, were cold and devoid of welcome. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He simply looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive sweep that took in her sensible bonnet, her plain face, her figure that was neither girlish nor ample. His gaze lingered on the fine lines etched around her eyes, the faint silver threads in her pulled-back hair. The knot in Eliza's stomach tightened into a vice. He stepped closer, and his voice, when he spoke, was low but carried an unexpected cruelty. 37? Your letter said late 20s. This won't do, he gestured vaguely, encompassing her entire being. I needed someone younger, stronger, someone who could still bear children. The words were blunt instruments, striking directly at her deepest anxieties, at the very reason she had undertaken this long, desperate journey. A wave of heat flushed her face, quickly receding to leave her skin cold and clammy. Shame, hot and bitter, rose in her throat. The other people on the platform seemed to shrink back, averted eyes confirming the public humiliation. A few whispers, like dry leaves skittering on the ground, reached her ears. Past her prime, she imagined them saying. A risk, sending for one that old, he continued, oblivious or uncaring of her distress. I've no use for this. I'll send you back on the next train. Pay for the ticket, of course. But that's the extent of it. He turned, already dismissing her, his mind seemingly on the inconvenience she represented. Eliza stood frozen, the valise suddenly weighing 100 pounds. Back to what? To the suffocating pity of distant relatives, to the quiet desperation of a life with no prospect, no purpose beyond fading into obscurity? She had sold the last of her meager belongings to afford this passage, pouring every last ounce of hope into this gamble. There was nothing to go back to. The dust seemed to swirl around her, vast and indifferent, mirroring the sudden emptiness inside her. She was stranded, unwanted, in a place that felt as desolate as her future. The man walked away without another word, leaving her standing alone on the platform under the wide, unforgiving sky. The train whistle blew a long, mournful sound, a promise of departure she would not be on. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile armor she had built around her heart. She felt utterly, profoundly lost. The train pulled away with a hiss and a shudder, leaving Eliza alone on the platform. The small cluster of people dispersed quickly, leaving her exposed to the harsh glare of the afternoon sun and the judgment of the empty space. She was a discarded parcel, left at the edge of the world. She clutched her valise, her knuckles white. Where could she go? The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a saloon, a general store, a livery, and a scattering of rough wooden buildings. No church offered sanctuary, no kindly face offered guidance. She was simply there. She walked slowly towards the main street, her steps uncertain. The few men she passed either stared with open curiosity or averted their gazes pointedly, as if acknowledging her presence was an embarrassment. The women, seen fleetingly through windows or doorways, offered no sign of recognition, no shared glance of sympathy. She was an anomaly, a failure, a woman who had dared to seek a future and found only rejection. She tried the general store, asking if there might be any work, any place for a lady to lodge. The proprietor, a stout man with weary eyes, shook his head. Nothing for a single woman, not here. Too much trouble. He didn't seem unkind, merely stating a brutal fact of this place. His gaze held a flicker of pity, which she found almost harder to bear than outright scorn. She tried the livery stable, thinking perhaps she could offer to clean or mend. The stable hand, a lanky young man, just smirked. "Don't need no extra hands, ma'am. Sides ain't really no place for you." The implication hung heavy in the air. A woman alone here was vulnerable prey. Fear, a cold knot she'd been trying to ignore, tightened its grip. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows, panic began to set in. She had nowhere to go. She couldn't stay on the platform all night. She sank onto a wooden bench outside the closed saloon, the rough wood digging into her back. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of anyone. She noticed a figure across the street, leaning against the false front of a deserted building. He had been there when she arrived, a quiet observer. Tall, lean, clad in worn, dark clothing, he blended into the shadows. He wasn't looking at her directly, but she felt the weight of his gaze. He was different from the others. There was a stillness about him, an air of competence and solitude. He wasn't part of the town's rhythm, not quite. She had overheard the storekeeper mention him vaguely to someone. The rancher out north, spoken with a mix of respect and wariness. He was known but clearly kept to himself. As dusk deepened, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the air grew colder. Eliza shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Her stomach ached with emptiness, and her spirit felt hollowed out. She watched the rancher across the street. He hadn't moved. He wasn't approaching, wasn't speaking, but his presence was a peculiar comfort in the oppressive emptiness. It wasn't pity she saw in his infrequent glances, but something else, a quiet assessment, perhaps. Or maybe just the simple acknowledgement of another human being struggling in a harsh landscape. She didn't know his name, knew nothing about him. Yet in that moment, he was the only anchor in a sea of despair. He remained there, a silent sentinel, as the stars began to prick the darkening sky. Just as the cold became unbearable and the thought of spending the night on the bench became a grim certainty, the figure across the street straightened. He walked deliberately across the dust, stopping a few feet from her. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes, dark and steady, taking her in. There was no judgment in them, only a quiet practicality. "Can't stay here, ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting. It wasn't a question. "Gets cold. And folks ain't always decent." Eliza swallowed, finding her voice shaky. I have nowhere else." The admission felt raw, humiliating. He nodded as if expecting the answer. "Got a place out north. Small cabin. Ain't fancy, but it's dry. Got food." He paused, his gaze steady. "Could use a hand tending the place. Cleaning, cooking. Nothing heavy." It was an offer, couched in necessity, stripped of any hint of charity. He wasn't offering her a home, but work, a temporary refuge tied to a need. It was a lifeline, offered without fanfare. Hope, a fragile butterfly, stirred in her chest. "Work," she managed. Pays not much. But it's honest." He waited, giving her space to decide. He didn't press, didn't explain further. She looked at his face in the fading light, rugged, weathered, kind eyes framed by deep lines. He was older than the man who had rejected her, closer to her own age, perhaps a bit more. This man saw her, not a list of desirable traits or a catalog entry. He saw someone in need and offered a practical solution. "My name's Thomas," he added quietly. "Eliza," she replied, the name feeling strange after being called a failure. "Yes, I'll take the work, Mr. Thomas." "Thank you." "Just Thomas," he said. He turned and began walking towards the livery. "Horses are ready. It's a bit of a ride." She pushed herself up, her limbs stiff and aching, the weariness of the day suddenly crashing over her. But there was a new kind of energy too, born of relief and a tentative spark of possibility. She followed him, her valise bumping against her leg. They rode mostly in silence under the vast, star-filled sky. The cold bit deep, but the quiet presence of Thomas riding beside her was a warmth she hadn't felt all day. He didn't pry, didn't ask about the train, about the man who had left her. He simply accepted her, a lost soul needing shelter, and offered what he could. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. It was a chance. Life on Thomas's small ranch north of Redemption Gulch was hard, but it was honest. The cabin was indeed small, but sturdy and clean. The work was demanding, hauling water from the well, keeping the small garden patch free of weeds, mending clothes, cooking simple, hearty meals over the fire. Eliza worked from dawn till dusk, her hands growing calloused, her muscles aching in new ways. But with each task completed, a sense of quiet accomplishment settled over her. She was useful. She was contributing. She was earning her keep. Thomas was a man of few words. Their conversations were sparse, often revolving around the practicalities of the ranch, the weather, the state of the fences, the welfare of the few cattle he kept. He spent his days out on the land, returning at dusk smelling of dust and pine. He was unfailingly respectful, his dark eyes meeting hers with a steady, calm gaze. He never mentioned the man who had rejected her, never commented on her age or appearance. He treated her simply as Eliza, the woman who helped him keep his small world running. Slowly, tentatively, a fragile trust began to grow between them. It wasn't built on shared confidences or emotional outpouring, but on shared silence, mutual respect, and the quiet rhythm of their days. He ensured she had firewood, that her boots were sturdy enough for the terrain. She made sure his meals were hot and waiting, his small cabin tidy. She learned to read his moods from the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. He seemed to sense when she was weary, offering an unexpected rest. They were two solitary people, bound together by circumstance, forging a connection in the crucible of shared hardship. One evening, a fierce storm raged outside, rattling the cabin walls. Eliza watched the rain lash against the small window, a tremor of fear running through her. Thomas sat by the fire, sharpening a knife. "Rough night," she murmured, more to break the silence than for conversation. He looked up, his gaze gentle in the firelight. "Aye, but the cabin's strong. It'll hold." His simple assurance was more comforting than any elaborate speech. In that moment, she saw not just the rugged rancher, but the quiet strength that resided within him. He wasn't just offering her shelter from the storm outside, but from the storms she carried within her. She started to share small details of her past, prompted by nothing more than the comfortable silence. About her quiet life in the East, the passing of her family, the necessity that had led her here. Thomas listened without interruption, his presence a solid anchor. He didn't offer platitudes, just listened. In return, he shared glimpses of his own story, the loneliness of building a life alone, the harshness of the land, the satisfaction of seeing something grow from the unforgiving soil. She began to see the depths beneath his stoic exterior, the resilience and quiet decency that defined him. She was no longer just a rejected mail-order bride. She was a woman finding her footing, finding her worth not in the eyes of a man seeking a young wife, but in the quiet acceptance of a man who saw her for who she was. The fear and despair that had gripped her upon arrival had not vanished entirely, but they were being slowly, steadily replaced by a quiet strength, a sense of purpose, and a growing, tentative warmth for the man who had given her a chance. The fragile peace they had built was threatened one biting cold afternoon. A rider approached the ranch, stirring the dogs into a frenzy of barking. Thomas stepped out, rifle held loosely. Eliza stood in the doorway, a knot of unease tightening in her chest. The rider was young, brash, and wore a look of arrogant entitlement. He introduced himself as a cousin of the man who had rejected her. "Heard Silas finally got rid of the old baggage," the cousin sneered, glancing at Eliza. "Sent me out to make sure you're gone. Silas said you caused him some trouble, refusing to leave when he told you." Eliza's blood ran cold, then hot with indignation. She hadn't refused to leave. She had been abandoned, and to be called old baggage again in front of Thomas. But before she could speak, Thomas stepped forward, his posture shifting, becoming subtly more formidable. "She's not gone," Thomas said. his voice dangerously quiet. And she ain't baggage. She's working for me. The cousin laughed. A harsh, unpleasant sound. Working? Doing what? Dusting his dentures. He gestured crudely towards Eliza. Silas said she was useless. Told him she was too old. Eliza flinched, but Thomas's hand rose, a silent command for her to stay put. His eyes, usually calm, held a dangerous glint. What Silas thinks is of no consequence here, Thomas said, his voice gaining an edge of steel. She's under my protection now. You got business with me, state it. You got business with her, you talk to me first. And you'll address her with respect. The cousin's smirk faltered slightly at the unexpected defiance and the quiet threat in Thomas's stance. Protection? From what? Yourself. He looked around the humble ranch. Silas just wants you to know you can't cause him problems. Don't expect him to take you back. He's already got a younger woman coming, the cruelty of it stung. But this time, Eliza didn't crumble. She met the cousin's gaze, her own hardening with a resolve born of her time here, of Thomas's quiet acceptance. Tell your cousin? Eliza said, stepping slightly forward, her voice steady despite a tremor in her hands, that he made a mistake, and I have no intention of troubling him further. My life is here now. Thomas looked at her then, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his eyes. He turned back to the cousin. You heard the lady. Now ride on. And don't come back. The finality in his tone, the way he stood shielding her, left no room for argument. The cousin hesitated, clearly unused to being defied. He shot Eliza a resentful look, then turned his horse and rode back the way he came. The silence that followed his departure was heavy. Eliza stood trembling slightly, the adrenaline fading. Thomas turned back to her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The dogs settled. The wind whistled. Then, Thomas reached out, his rough hand gently touching her arm. You were brave, he said simply. It was more praise than he had ever offered. Eliza looked up at him, seeing the depth of his quiet strength, the unwavering protectiveness he extended to her. It wasn't pity, wasn't obligation. It was a choice. He called me old, she said, the words raw. Thomas looked at her face, the lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair. He didn't deny her words. Instead, he said, age is just time passing. It's what's inside that matters. And you, Eliza, you've got more strength and decency in your little finger than that man has in his whole body. He didn't say she was beautiful or young. He said she was strong and decent. And in that desolate place, from this quiet, honest man, those words meant everything. He didn't declare his love with grand pronouncements, and she didn't weep with relief. They simply stood there, the wind whipping around them, two souls who had been adrift, finding harbor in each other's quiet company. Later that evening, by the fire, Thomas spoke again, his voice softer than usual. This life is not easy. Not for a woman alone, he paused, looking into the flames. But you're not alone now. If you'll have me. Eliza's heart swelled. It wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense, but an offering of partnership, of a shared future built on mutual respect and resilience. I will, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas, I will, he nodded, a small, rare smile touching his lips. It wasn't the passionate romance she might have dreamt of in her youth, but something deeper, more enduring. It was the quiet comfort of acceptance, the strength of shared purpose, the profound connection of two people weathering life's storms side by side. She had come seeking a husband and had been rejected for being too old. Instead, she had found a man who saw her true worth, and in doing so, helped her find it herself. Life wouldn't be easy here, but it would be theirs. And it would be real.